Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. M1 Abrams. The M1 Abrams is an American third-generation main battle tank named for General Creighton Abrams. Highly mobile, designed for modern armored ground warfare, the M1 is well-armed and heavily armored. Notable features include the use of a powerful multi-fuel turbine engine, the adoption of sophisticated composite armor, and separate ammunition storage in a blow-out compartment for crew safety. Weighing nearly 68 short tons, it is one of the heaviest main battle tanks in service. The M1 Abrams entered U.S. service in 1980, ultimately replacing the M60 tank. The M1 is the main battle tank of the United States Army and Marine Corps, along with the armies of Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and Iraq. Three main versions of the M1 Abrams have been deployed: the M1, M1A1, and M1A2, incorporating improved armament, protection, and electronics. These improvements and other upgrades to in-service tanks have allowed this long-serving vehicle to remain in front-line service. In addition, development of the improved M1A3 version was first publicly disclosed in 2009. Extensive improvements have been implemented to the latest M1A2 SEEP-3 version. History. The M1 Abrams was developed during the Cold War as a successor to the cancelled MBT-70. The M1 Abrams contract went to Chrysler Defense, and was the first vehicle to adopt shotgun armor. Adaptations before the Persian Gulf War gave the vehicle better firepower and NBC protection, being vastly superior to Iraqi tanks. Very few M1 tanks were hit by enemy fire. Upgrades after the war improved the tank's weapon sights and fire control unit. The Abrams participated in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, exposing vulnerabilities in urban combat that were addressed with the tank urban survival kit modifications. The Marine Corps sent a company of M1A1 Abrams tanks to Afghanistan in 2010. Development. The first attempt to replace the M60 tank, which was introduced in 1960, was the MBT-70, developed in partnership with West Germany in the 1960s. The MBT-70 project, which attained testing readiness in 1968, had advanced features such as a height-adjustable air suspension and a very low-profile chassis with the driver located in the turret. The MBT-70 ultimately proved to be too heavy, complex, and expensive. As a result of the imminent failure of this project, the U.S. Army introduced the XM803, using some technologies from the MBT-70, but removing some of the more troublesome features. This succeeded only in producing an expensive system with capabilities similar to the M60. Congress cancelled the MBT-70 in November and XM803 December 1971, and redistributed the funds to the new XM815, later renamed the XM1 Abrams after General Creighton Abrams. Prototypes were delivered in 1976 by Chrysler Defense and General Motors, armed with the license-built version of the 105mm Royal Ordnance L7 gun along with a Leopard 2.2K prototype for comparison. The turbine-powered Chrysler Defense design was selected for development as the M1. Chrysler had significant experience designing turbine-powered land vehicles going back to the 1950s. In February 1982, General Dynamics Land Systems Division purchased Chrysler Defense, after Chrysler built over 1,000 M1s. A total of 3,273 M1 Abrams tanks were produced during 1979-85 and first entered U.S. Army service in 1980. Production at the government-owned, GDLS-operated Lima Army Tank Plant in Lima, Ohio, was joined by vehicles built at the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant in Warren, Michigan from 1982 to 1996. The M1 was armed with the license-built version of the 105mm Royal Ordnance L7 gun. An improved model called the M1 IP was produced briefly in 1984 and contained small upgrades. The M1 IP models were used in the Canadian Army Trophy NATO tank gunnery competition in 1985 and 1987. About 5,000 M1A1 Abrams tanks were produced from 1986-92 and featured the M256 smoothbore cannon developed by Rheinmetall AG of Germany for the Leopard 2, improved armor, and a CBRN protection system. Production of M1 and M1A1 tanks totaled some 9,000 tanks at a cost of approximately $4.3 million per unit. By 1999, costs for the tank were upwards of a vehicle. In 1990, Project on Government Oversight in a report criticized the M1's high costs and low fuel efficiency in comparison with other tanks of similar power and effectiveness such as the Leopard 2. The report was based on data from U.S. Army sources and the Congressional Record. As the Abrams entered service in the 1980s, they operated alongside M60A3 within the United States military, and with other NATO tanks in numerous Cold War exercises. These exercises usually took place in Western Europe, especially West Germany, but also in some other countries, including South Korea. The exercises were aimed at countering Soviet forces. However, by January 1991, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and the Abrams was instead deployed in the Middle East. Gulf War. The Abrams remained untested in combat until the Persian Gulf War in 1991. During Operation Desert Storm, a total of 1,848 M1A1s were deployed to Saudi Arabia to participate in the liberation of Kuwait. The M1A1 was superior to Iraq's Soviet-era T-55 and T-62 tanks, as well as T-72 versions imported from the Soviet Union and Poland. Polish officials state no license-produced T-72 tanks were finished prior to the Iraqi Taji tank plant being destroyed in 1991. The T-72s, like most Soviet export designs, lacked night vision systems and then modern rangefinders, though they did have some night fighting tanks with older active infrared systems or floodlights. A total of 23 M1A1s were damaged or destroyed during the war. Of the 9 Abrams tanks destroyed, 7 were destroyed by friendly fire, and 2 were purposely destroyed to prevent capture after being damaged. Some others took minor combat damage, with little effect on their operational readiness. Very few M1 tanks were hit by enemy fire, which resulted in no fatalities and only a handful of wounded. The M1A1 was capable of making kills at ranges in excess of 2,500 meters. This range was crucial in combat against previous generation tanks of Soviet design in Desert Storm. As the effective range of the main gun in the Soviet/Iraqi tanks was less than 2,000 meters, this meant Abrams tanks could hit Iraqi tanks before the enemy got in range, a decisive advantage in this kind of combat. In friendly fire incidents, the front armor and foreside turret armor survived direct armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot hits from other M1A1s. This was not the case for the side armor of the hull and the rear armor of the turret, as both areas were penetrated on at least 2 occasions by unintentional strikes by depleted uranium ammunition during the Battle of Norfolk. During Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, some M1IP and M1A1s were modified locally in theater by modification work orders with additional rolled homogeneous armor plating welded on the turret front. The M1 can be equipped with mine plow and mine roller attachments. Upgrades. The M1A2 was a further improvement of the M1A1 with a commander's independent thermal viewer, weapon station, position navigation equipment, and a full set of controls and displays linked by a digital data bus. These upgrades also provided the M1A2 with an improved fire control system. The M1A2 system enhancement package added digital maps, Force 21 Battle Command Brigade and below Linux communication system capabilities for commanders, and an improved cooling system to compensate for heat generated by the additional computer systems. The M1A2 SEP also serves as the basis for the M104 Wolverine Heavy Assault Bridge. The M1A2 SEP2 added common remotely operated weapon station support, color displays, better interfaces, a new operating system, better front and side armor, and an upgraded transmission for better durability. Further upgrades included depleted uranium armor for all variants, a system overhaul that returns all A1s to like new condition, a digital enhancement package for the A1, and a commonality program to standardize parts between the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps. The development for the improved M1A3 variant has been known since 2009. Iraq War. Further combat was seen during 2003 when U.S. forces invaded Iraq and opposed Ba'athist Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein in the Iraq War's Operation Iraqi Freedom. As of March 2005, approximately 80 Abrams tanks were forced out of action by enemy attacks. One achievement of the M1A1s was the destruction of 7 T-72s in a point-blank skirmish near Mahmoudiyah, about 18 miles south of Baghdad, with no American losses. In addition to the Abrams' heavy armament, some crews were also issued M136 AT-4 shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons under the assumption that they might have to engage heavy armor in tight urban areas where the main gun could not be brought to bear. Following lessons learned in Desert Storm, the Abrams and many other U.S. combat vehicles used in the conflict were fitted with combat identification panels to reduce friendly fire incidents. These were fitted on the sides and rear of the turret, with flat panels equipped with a four-cornered box image on either side of the turret front. Some Abrams tanks were also fitted with a secondary storage bin on the back of the existing bustle rack on the rear of the turret to enable the crew to carry more supplies and personal belongings. Several Abrams tanks that were irrecoverable due to loss of mobility or other circumstances were destroyed by friendly forces, usually by other Abrams tanks, to prevent their capture. Some Abrams tanks were disabled by Iraqi infantrymen in ambushes during the invasion. Some troops employed short-range anti-tank rockets and fired at the tracks, rear and top. Other tanks were put out of action by engine fires when flammable fuel stored externally in turret racks was hit by small arms fire and spilled into the engine compartment. A majority of Abrams tanks damaged in post-invasion Iraq were by improvised explosive devices. By December 2006, more than 530 Abrams tanks had been shipped back to the U.S. for repair. Due to the vulnerability of tanks in urban combat, the Tank Urban Survival Kit was issued to some M1 Abrams tanks. It added protection in the rear and side of the tank to improve fighting ability in urban environments. In May 2008, it was reported that an American M1 tank had also been damaged by insurgent fire of and rebounds per Game 29, which uses a tandem charge high-explosive anti-tank warhead to penetrate explosive reactive armor as well as composite armor behind it, in Iraq. The U.S. considered the rebounds per Game 29 threat to American armor high, and refused to allow the newly formed Iraqi Army to buy it, fearing that it would fall into the insurgents' hands. Iraqi Army service. Between 2010 and 2012, the U.S. supplied 140 refurbished M1A1 Abrams tanks to Iraq. In mid-2014, they saw action when the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant launched the June 2014 Northern Iraq Offensive. During 3 months, about one-third of the Iraqi Army's M1 tanks had been damaged or destroyed by Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and some were captured by opposing forces. By December 2014, the Iraqi Army only had about 40 operational Abrams left. That month, the U.S. Department of State approved the sale of another 175 Abrams to Iraq. Iranian-backed Iraqi Shiite Kataib Hezbollah reported to operate M1 Abrams, and released publicity showing the tanks being transported by trucks to take part in the Battle of Mosul. It is not known whether the tanks were captured from ISIS, seized from Iraq's military, or handed over. One Iraqi-operated Abrams has been nicknamed the Beast, after it became the lone working tank when taking back the town of Hit in April 2016, destroying enemy fighting positions and IED emplacements. In October 2017, Abrams were used by the Iraqi security forces and the Popular Mobilization Units in assaults against the Kurdistan Regional Government Peshmerga in the town of Altan-Kupri. It was claimed by Kurdish commanders that at least one Abrams was destroyed by the Peshmerga. War in Afghanistan. Tanks may have limited utility in Afghanistan due to the mountainous terrain, although Canada and Denmark have deployed Leopard 1 and 2 MBTs that have been specially modified to operate in the relatively flat and arid conditions of southwestern Afghanistan. In late 2010, at the request of Regional Command Southwest, the U.S. Marine Corps deployed a small detachment of 14 M1A1 Abrams tanks from Delta Company, 1st Tank Battalion, 1st Marine Division, to southern Afghanistan in support of operations in Helmand and Kandahar provinces. Saudi Arabia. After the start of the Saudi Arabian intervention in Yemen during the 2015 Yemeni civil war, Saudi Arabian M1A2 MBTs were deployed near the Saudi Arabian/Yemeni border. In August 2016, the US approved a deal to sell up to 153 more Abrams tanks to Saudi Arabia, including 20 battle damage replacements, suggesting that some Saudi Arabian Abrams had been destroyed or severely damaged in combat in Yemen. Production shutdown. The U.S. Army planned to end production at the Lima Army tank plant from 2013 to 2016 in an effort to save over $1 billion. It would be restarted in 2017 to upgrade existing tanks. General Dynamics Land Systems, which operates the factory, opposed the move, arguing that suspension of operations would increase long-term costs and reduce flexibility. Specifically, GDLS estimated that closing the plant would cost $380 million and restarting production would cost $1.3 billion. By August 2013, Congress had allocated $181 million for buying parts and upgrading Abrams systems to mitigate industrial base risks and sustain development and production capability. Congress and General Dynamics were criticized for redirecting money to keep production lines open and accused of forcing the Army to buy tanks it didn't need. General Dynamics asserted that a 4-year shutdown would cost $1.10 $1.6 billion to reopen the line, depending on the length of the shutdown, whether machinery would be kept operating, and whether the plant's components would be completely removed. They contended that the move was to upgrade Army National Guard units to expand a pure fleet and maintain production of identified, irreplaceable subcomponents. A prolonged shutdown could cause their makers to lose their ability to produce them, and foreign tank sales were not guaranteed to keep production lines open. There is still risk of production gaps even with production extended through 2015. With funds awarded before recapitalization is needed, budgetary pressures may push planned new upgrades for the Abrams from 2017 to 2019. In December 2014, Congress again allocated $120 million, against the wishes of the Army, for Abrams upgrades, including improving gas mileage by integrating an auxiliary power unit to decrease idle time fuel consumption and upgrading the tank's sights and sensors. Future plans. The tracked M8 armored gun system was conceived as a possible supplement for the Abrams in U.S. service. For low-intensity conflict in the early 1990s, prototypes were made, but the program was cancelled. The 8-wheeled M1128 mobile gun system was designed to supplement the Abrams in U.S. service for low-intensity conflicts. It has been introduced into service and serves with Stryker brigades. The U.S. Army's Future Combat Systems XM1202 mounted combat system was to replace the Abrams in U.S. service and was in development when funding for the program was cut from the DoD's budget. Engineering Change Proposal 1 is a 2-part upgrade process. IC-1A adds space, weight, and power improvements, and active protection against improvised explosive devices. 9 IC-1A prototypes have been produced as of October 2014. IC-1B, which will begin development in 2015, may include sensor upgrades and the convergence of several tank round capabilities into a multi-purpose round. The M1A2 Septusk Abrams and a modernized M1 Abrams were included in the ground combat vehicle analysis of alternatives. Vehicles included in the OA were determined to be inferior to the planned GCV. The U.S. Army Vice Chief of Staff General Peter Chiarelli commended the M1 Abrams program and recommended a similar approach for the GCV program. The ground combat vehicle family of vehicles was the planned successor to the M1, as well as many other U.S. Army vehicles. However, the Army anticipates that the remaining M1A1 fleet will remain in U.S. service until at least 2021, and the M1A2 to beyond 2050. The M1A3 Abrams was in the early design period with the U.S. Army in 2009. At that time, the service was seeking a lighter tank version with the same protection as current versions. It aimed to build prototypes by 2014 and begin fielding the first combat-ready M1A3s by 2017. In March 2017, it was reported that the new version, the M1A2 SEP V4, is to begin testing in 2021. Additionally, an all-new version for the U.S. Army has been in planning and development for several years. Camouflage. Earlier U.S. military vehicles, used from World War I through the Vietnam War, used a scheme of olive drab, often with large white stars. Prototypes. Early production M1 and M1 IP models switched to a flat forest green paint scheme. The large white insignia stars have also transitioned to much smaller black markings. Some units painted their M1s with the older Mobility Equipment Research and Design Command 4-color paint scheme, but the turn-in requirements for these tanks required repainting them to overall forest green. Therefore, even though a large number of the base model M1s were camouflaged in the field, few or none exist today. M1A1s came from the factory with the NATO 3-color camouflage black/med green/dark brown chemical agent resistant coating paint jobs. Today M1A1s are given the NATO 3-color paint job during rebuilds. M1s and M1A1s deployed to Operation Desert Storm were hastily painted Desert Dan. Some, but not all, of these tanks were repainted to their authorized paint scheme. M1A2s built for Middle Eastern countries were painted in Desert Dan. Replacement parts are painted olive green, which can sometimes lead to vehicles with a patchwork of green and desert tan parts. Australian M1A1s were Desert Dan when delivered, but have undergone a transition to the Australian Army vehicle standard disruptive pattern camouflage, a scheme that consists of black, olive drab, and brown. The U.S. Army can equip its Abrams tanks with the Saab Barracuda camouflage system, which provides concealment against visual, infrared, thermal infrared, and broadband radar detection. Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Would you like to know more?